Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into something that's, well, it's a huge, kind of messy, but really crucial question for our digital culture right now. We're looking at this tension, this friction between the freedom to express yourself creatively and, on the other hand, maybe some kind of cultural quality control. So, put simply, should amateur artists feel totally free to create and publish low-effort stuff, maybe work from their learning phase, the kind of raw, sometimes awkward output that gets labeled as slop?
Right. And the equally important counterpoint, the other side of that coin, is whether this just overwhelming volume of unfiltered content risks fundamentally, poisoning the well. Does it damage the whole creative culture, making it almost impossible for genuinely thoughtful, high-quality work to even get noticed, let alone valued?
Exactly. So today, we're asking, when does the freedom to make, well, frankly, bad art, start to maybe harm the cultural environment for everybody else? I'll be taking the position that, yes, amateur artists should freely create and publish, whatever the quality might look like initially. I'm focusing on the psychological benefits, the growth aspect, inclusivity, and fundamentally, the right to authentic expression.
And I'll be arguing that publication, particularly in this digital age, it really requires a sense of cultural stewardship. Look, the act of creation itself, absolutely, it's free. Go nuts. But the act of mass publishing, broadcasting it out there, that carries a distinct societal responsibility. And if we ignore that, I think it leads straight to cultural dilution and, frankly, the cynical exploitation of our collective, very scarce attention.
Okay, so my core argument really is that creativity isn't some kind of luxury item reserved only for the highly skilled. It feels more like a human necessity, right? And trying to suppress amateur creation, even if, yeah, objectively it is slop, it feels like a form of gatekeeping. It just reinforces elitism and feeds into that toxic comparison culture that's already, let's be honest, running rampant on most platforms.
See, I approach it slightly differently. I absolutely agree, 100%, that creation is a human right. But for me, there's a very bright line between, say, doodling in your private sketchbook and publishing something onto a feed potentially seen by billions. Publication, I think, demands responsibility. So my thesis is that the sheer volume of low-effort content, and I mean especially the mass-generated kind we're starting to see, it erodes cultural standards. It exploits the very architecture of the attention economy, and ultimately it degrades the public's trust in whether anything they see online is actually authentic art.
But let's just focus on the individual for a second. The act of making art, even if it turns out poorly, can be deeply therapeutic. I mean, study after study shows that creative self-expression is a fantastic tool for improving mood, for building self-esteem, for fostering social belonging within communities. And probably the single biggest hurdle for any beginner is that fear, that paralysis of creating slop. So if we start restricting that pipeline of amateur work, we just reinforce this damaging idea that failure is unacceptable. But growth, real growth, requires failure. Publishing that rough work, that 5-minute doodle maybe, right next to a professional's rendering, it actually normalizes imperfection. It can serve as this vital psychological defense against the, frankly, impossible standards set by super-polished commercialized content.
That's a very compelling argument for the individual's psychological well-being. I grant you that. But my concern shifts to the cost that's imposed on the collective. We have to distinguish right off the bat between what you might call human slop, that necessary, maybe naive, novice exploration you're describing, which is fine, and machine slop, or maybe cynical slop. That's the low-effort content that's just mass-produced purely to exploit algorithmic engagement loops. While I celebrate the beginner's first raw videos, the problem is that this deluge of content, which, let's face it, often gets prioritized by algorithms simply because it is easily digestible and maybe shallowly engaging, it makes it exponentially harder for audiences to find and appreciate the truly excellent work, the complex stuff, the slow-burn art that requires a bit more effort.
Okay, but doesn't this push for filtering, even if you're just trying to filter out the cynical slop, doesn't it inevitably rely on subjective standards? And don't those standards often end up reinforcing privilege? I mean, historically, the criteria used to label something as slop or low art, they often reflected class bias, right? Like a lack of formal training, not having access to expensive tools, or maybe not adhering to established, often very Eurocentric artistic norms. Think about early YouTube, when it was really taking off. Or platforms like TikTok, now that sometimes reward authenticity and novelty over pure technical polish. Those cultural moments happen precisely because the traditional gatekeepers and their, professional standards were bypassed or just plain ignored.
I'm not totally convinced that advocating for some kind of standards automatically equates to protecting privilege or just imposing arbitrary taste. Standards, I think, protect cultural value. We need some kind of functional filtering mechanism. Think about the analogy of, say, a traditional publishing house. They don't filter based on who can afford the nicest pen, right? They filter to ensure, hopefully, a baseline level of quality, and crucially, to protect the reader's investment of their time. When platforms become totally saturated, and especially now with the rise of those machine-generated controversies we saw erupting a couple of years back, it just reduces art to a kind of manipulation, and that erodes the public trust that any piece of content they encounter that's highly visible is actually the product of genuine human effort and investment.
But that comparison to traditional publishing houses, it kind of falls apart immediately in a digital context, doesn't it? The internet is fundamentally a decentralized broadcast medium. It's not a carefully curated bookstore shelf. And that distinction, I think, brings us right to the heart of this question about responsibility in publishing. You're arguing for a societal responsibility. I'm arguing that trying to restrict publication, especially for amateurs, starts to look an awful lot like censorship of the learning process itself.
That's an interesting framing, though I might put it slightly differently. Free expression isn't absolute, right? It's always contextual, particularly when it interacts with finite resources like, say, public attention. We're not talking about censoring someone's private sketchbook here. We're talking about the right or lack thereof to blast potentially 1 trillion pieces of content into a shared ecosystem. Now, if that published content actively exploits these scarce attention markets, if it creates an environment where noise just consistently drowns out signal, then publication must carry some form of responsibility. It just has to.
But defining and enforcing that responsibility without falling back into the kind of gatekeeping that I think we both agree is problematic, that's incredibly difficult. You're essentially asking the novice creator, maybe someone whose intent is purely therapeutic or just educational, for themselves to somehow bear the burden of policing the entire attention economy. The core problem, as I see it, isn't the existence of a hobbyist's 5-minute sketch online. It's the algorithmic architecture underneath it all that places that sketch right next to a master's 1,000-hour digital rendering, completely flattening the scale and making that comparison inherently toxic. We should be looking at regulating the platform's mediation, not the creator's initial impulse to share.
I do appreciate the focus on the platforms. That's definitely part of it. But the content is the platform in a way. If we accept this idea of an attention economy, and I think we have to, then we also have to acknowledge the ethical burden on the creator, who perhaps cynically just contributes noise to it. I mean, take those low-effort NFT projects that absolutely flooded the market a few years back. The intent there was pretty clearly pure monetization, right? Through manufactured scarcity, using mass-produced, often very low-value images just to chase quick profit. That feels like spam to me, not really expression. We have to try and define that line between, say, adaptation, an artist maybe responding to genuine market demand, and outright manipulation, just chasing algorithms for clicks and profit without any real genuine investment in the craft itself.
Okay, I can certainly concede that cynical, machine-accelerated manipulation is a genuine problem. But focusing so heavily on that extreme risk feels like it risks erasing the immense value in the vast, vast majority of totally harmless amateur work. And I guess I worry that your preoccupation with volume and standards leads down the path of cultural fatalism.
Well, that brings us squarely to the question of standards and collective taste, doesn't it? I do worry about the cumulative effect. Flooding the market, especially with low-quality material, I think it does lower collective taste over time.
If there's no form of cultural stewardship, no effective curation, standards just naturally drift downward. It makes audiences less discerning, potentially. If people are just constantly bombarded with the lowest common denominator, that inevitably becomes the baseline for what they seek out and, eventually, what they value.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. It feels like it underestimates the adaptive intelligence of the audience. Consumers don't just passively absorb whatever's thrown at them, they adapt, they curate. They form specialized communities around very specific aesthetics. These niche audiences that are totally ignored by the big mass appeal algorithms that are only chasing the next viral hit. And furthermore, history is just littered with examples of stuff initially dismissed as slop that later evolved into vital cultural movements. You mentioned punk aesthetics earlier, originally derided as amateurish, unskilled. Or think about something like fan fiction, which for years was dismissed, but is now recognized as a major, formative kind of cultural literacy for millions of people. Abundance, I think, strengthens diversity and actually democratizes taste rather than lowering it to some kind of bland, homogenous standard.
That's a powerful point, and the rise of niche curation is certainly a mitigating factor. I agree. However, we still need to maintain some conceptual clarity here. If we want to have a productive discussion about the impact of slop, we probably need to agree, at least roughly, on what we're criticizing. You mentioned earlier that the definition of slop is inherently subjective.
It absolutely is. What one person finds utterly meaningless, another might find incredibly raw or charming, or maybe perfectly reflective of a particular cultural moment. Gatekeeping based purely on technical skill is just inherently risky because, like we discussed, it so often risks reflecting economic privilege or these entrenched, often Eurocentric art norms. Maybe the value should be placed more on the process, on the community that forms around it, on the impact it has on the creator themselves, not just on some measurable investment of time that inevitably favors the formally trained artist.
I agree that measurable skill shouldn't be the final arbiter, but intentionality, dedication, perhaps those can be measured, or at least inferred as maybe proxies for respect towards the craft, towards the audience. Let's return to that distinction I made earlier because I think it's crucial. We need to separate human slop, that naive, often necessary exploration of the novice, from machine slop. That's the automated, mass-produced stuff, often accelerated by AI, made without care or genuine human meaning. The ethical problem, the thing that I believe genuinely poisons the well, arises when art is produced without that care, without dedication, without responsibility towards the consumer's time and attention.
I appreciate you acknowledging the necessity, or at least the existence, of human slop, but I'm still not convinced that the broader ecosystem of amateur creation poses such a fundamental threat that it warrants trying to stifle that expression.
Okay, let me try to make the link clearer, perhaps, between this sort of amateur content ecosystem and potential systemic harm. The general acceptance, maybe even normalization of low-effort, mass-produced content, it can create a fertile ground for misinformation and scams. We know from studies that false news tends to spread faster on social media, partly because algorithms often favor novelty and easy engagement, which are the exact characteristics you find in a lot of this slop content, whether it's artistic or informational.
Wait, are you suggesting that like a poorly rendered doodle and a piece of deliberate political disinformation are somehow treated identically by the system?
Functionally, in terms of algorithmic valuation, often, yes. The system can treat both as essentially unvetted content streams, optimized for rapid virality potential. The ethical burden, as I see it, is that by allowing basically every form of low-effort content to flood the zone, malicious material, like deliberate disinformation or financial scams cleverly disguised as cultural projects, slips through much more easily under this generalized banner of free expression. The blurred boundaries just make it exponentially harder for platforms or anyone to regulate the proven harms effectively, because the entire ecosystem is kind of built on this foundation of low-friction, high-volume production.
Okay, I see the connection you're drawing. The algorithmic mechanism is indeed often the same. However, the solution cannot be to ask beginners to self-censor their learning process. Regulation has to target the proven harm, the disinformation, the hate speech, the financial scams, explicitly and, frankly, ruthlessly. We shouldn't use the fear of political or financial manipulation as an excuse to silence the vast majority of generalized amateur expression, especially when it holds potentially immense therapeutic value for the creator. That psychological well-being and the unpredictable cultural innovation that can spring from amateur freedom, it's just too important to risk stifling because we're scared about distinct, though related, harmful content. We need better platform filters for the actual scams and deepfakes, not self-censorship from novices trying things out.
The fight then really boils down to who bears the operational burden of quality control. Is it the creator who adds to the noise? Is it the platform that arguably profits from that noise? Or is it the consumer who's left to sift through it all, often at the expense of their limited time and attention?
Precisely. So, to wrap this up from my perspective, the immense benefits we get from inclusivity, from supporting psychological health, and just from the sheer unpredictability of cultural innovation that comes from allowing all forms of expression, regardless of immediate technical quality, I believe those strongly outweigh the sort of theoretical risks of cultural dilution. The focus has got to be on regulating the truly malicious content and the exploitative algorithmic mechanisms, not on policing the vast majority of harmless exploring amateur artists. Today's rough draft is, quite often, tomorrow's cultural breakthrough.
And my position remains that unfettered mass publication, especially in this digital age, supercharged by powerful technology and often motivated by a cynical chase for clicks and engagement, it inevitably results in cultural erosion and the exploitation of our scarcest collective resource, attention. If we genuinely value cultural excellence, and I think we should, then publication simply cannot be a consequence-free activity. We have to find ways to foster a genuine sense of stewardship for our shared cultural environment.
So the central tension we've wrestled with today, it really remains unresolved, doesn't it? Does inclusivity necessarily require lowering our collective standards? Or is it possible for creative freedom and high quality to coexist, perhaps through better mediation, smarter curation tools, maybe platform accountability?
Yeah. The answer, which I suspect will unfold over the next few years, it really involves that critical interplay between the individual's freedom to explore, the platform's responsibility to mediate that exploration, the community's role in stewardship and setting norms, and fundamentally, the underlying mechanics of the attention economy itself. It's complex.